Islam is a subject that we really can't get away from today. Almost every night in the news, it's there. Every night. There are many, many Muslim immigrants coming into Western countries. Each year in our universities, the Islamic societies run Islamic Awareness Weeks, and these are getting more and more prominent each year. Islam shapes the direction of our world, but it's also a religion that can be hard to speak about because maybe we just don't know much about it and so we're not sure what to say. Maybe we're scared to say something because if we say something, what might happen to us? We may feel intimidated, particularly as some people in our nation have been taken to court over saying things about Islam. Maybe you feel that Islam is not your business. It's not my business to say anything about this. But as Christians, Islam is our business. It's our business for several reasons. Firstly, the Quran itself actually addresses Christians. Let me read to you that first quote in your notes there. "O you people of the book," which is the way the Quran talks about Christians and Jews. It says, "O people of the book, believe in what we have now revealed, confirming what was already with you." You see, the Quran actually speaks to Christians and Jews and asks them to believe in the Quran. Islam actively seeks to convert Christians. There are thousands of Muslims who are trained to go out to bring Islam to Christians, to accept Muhammad and the Quran. Islam actually teaches a new gospel message. It has a message about Jesus, a different gospel, a whole new understanding of Jesus to bring to the world. Islam calls upon Christians to reject the notion that Jesus died on the cross and to reject that he is the Son of God. And finally, many of the applications that Muhammad gives in the Quran to his followers directly apply to Christians. So Muhammad gives commands in the Quran to Muslims about what they should do with Christians. So Islam is your business. It's your business to discuss and to consider it because Islam itself has made it your business. You have the right to do so. And tonight I want to give the big picture about the history of Islam. Well, first of all, let's look at Muhammad's world. Well, who was this Muhammad? Muhammad is the founder of Islam. He is an Arab, a member of the Quraysh tribe. This Quraysh tribe was located in the city of Mecca, and this tribe was the keeper of the holy Arab shrine called the Kaaba. It was a sacred site for the Arab religion. When was Muhammad alive? Well, it was the end of the 6th to the beginning of the 7th century AD. He was born 570 AD and died 632 AD. And the main two cities of his activities were the cities of Mecca and Medina, which are shown there on your map. Now, what was the world like at this time? Well, if we look at the empires at this time, we see that off to the east was the Persian or the Sasanian Empire. It was located from India right across to the lower parts of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The religion here was Zoroastrian, and being the empire of the east, it was generally at war to some degree with the Byzantine Empire off to the west. Its contact with Arabia was through trade, and just from being close to it, it had various wars with the people there. There was contact with Arabia. Off to the west was the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the remnant of the Roman Empire in the east. Rome in the west had fallen to the barbarians, and Constantinople was the new Rome, as it was called, in the east. It was located from Greece down through Turkey, down Damascus and Jerusalem, and then Egypt. It was a Christian country, and by the 6th, 7th century, Christianity had had a long history in this empire. Its contact with Arabia was through trade. Traders through the Byzantine Empire would go to India, down through the Red Sea. In fact, the Byzantine Emperor Constantius in the 4th century sent ambassadors and missionaries to Yemen to seek permission to build churches for the Byzantine travellers who wished to worship, and also to evangelise down there. And so as the Byzantine seamen would travel down the Red Sea on their way to India, they would stop at these places at the churches that they had built there and worship on the way. The Byzantine Empire also had contact with the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula through various military campaigns, through trying to conquer it in various ways or working alongside of the Arabs in various battles. Off to the west was the Abyssinian kingdom. This is sort of located in modern-day Ethiopia. Now, this was actually an African kingdom, and it had been Christian from the 4th century AD. And it had lots of contact with Western Arabia, particularly the area where Muhammad was, just because of its close proximity. There was lots of trade and various wars that these areas had had with each other. Finally, if we consider Arabia itself, the Arabs were famous for their trading in spices and incense, but they also had a number of small kingdoms. But they were small kingdoms. There was no great empire that had ever arisen down in this peninsula. They had had some powerful people in the past, particularly a Queen Zenobia, who in the 3rd century actually conquered the Byzantines, conquered the Roman Empire at that time, and brought under Arab control Egypt and Palestine and Turkey. So the Arabs had already had a history of conquering that region. But Arabia was strongly tribal and was not a superpower. In fact, very often they were caught between the superpowers of the Byzantines and the Persians. To some degree, they even acted as a buffer between those two empires. The people of Arabia themselves are Semitic peoples. There are many different tribes there, and the name Arab encompasses many different tribes who are the Semitic peoples. The Jews are a Semitic people along with the Arabs, and they are related linguistically and ethnically to the Arabs. The religions in Arabia at the time of Muhammad were many. There was the indigenous Arab religion. This in its original form was something called animism, which is the worship of nature, and in particular the worship of stones. But to this was added idolatry and polytheism. The chief stone, though, that was worshipped, which was possibly a meteorite, was something called the black stone, which is held in special awe, and that was worshipped in Mecca, the black stone. But the Jews were down there. As I said, the Jews were ethnically related to the Arabs, and it was far easier for the Jews to move down the Arabian Peninsula than to move almost anywhere else, because this was their related people. And the Jews had many towns and cities in this area. A whole range of tribes lived in Medina, and they were famous for their farming and their agriculture that they carried out in that region. Christianity had a long presence in this region as well. Down in Yemen, for the Najrain tribe, they were a Christian tribe, and up in the northeast of Arabia, up in Bahrain, there were many Christians up there, and Bible colleges or monasteries had a long history of being up there as well. In fact, Yemen itself had been a Christian kingdom, but then they were overthrown, and then it had been a Jewish kingdom. We often think of Jewish kingdoms as just as being in Solomon and King David, but the Jews had other kingdoms, and they were down the Arabian Peninsula. Amongst the Arabs, in terms of religion, there were also seekers. Many of the Arabs were dissatisfied with the polytheism and the animism of their fellow Arabs, and many of them had turned to Christianity or to Judaism. Muhammad's uncle was one of these men who'd become a Christian. Some of them, though, hadn't turned to Judaism or to Christianity, but they still preached about one God. And even before Muhammad, just before him, there were preachers amongst the Meccans who were sort of like Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad was just one man amongst many prophets in the Arabian Peninsula. There were many prophets there at that time. It seems that most of the towns had their own prophet who led them in some way or another. Now, the conclusion I just want to draw from painting that picture is that Muhammad was surrounded by Jews and Christians, and he was actively involved with Jews and Christians, because as a trader, he would travel from Mecca to Syria and go to the Christian kingdoms and have to deal with these people and be exposed to them. His followers, as we'll learn about later on, when they were persecuted, they fled Mecca and went for safety to Abyssinia, to the Christian kingdom where they lived and were given safety. He had Christian and Jewish wives. And the Quran itself records evangelism happening, that the Jews and the Christians were actively teaching their faith down on the Arabian Peninsula. But it's not just that Muhammad was surrounded by Jews and Christians. We see that he was actually influenced by them. That Muhammad followed the practices or the sunnah of the Christians and the Jews. Let me just read to you from one of the hadiths, one of the accounts of Muhammad's life here, narrated by Ibn Abbas. The Prophet used to copy the people of the Scriptures, that is the Jews and the Christians. The Prophet used to copy the people of the Scriptures in matters in which he had no order from Allah. The people of the Scriptures used to let their hair hang down, while the pagans used to part their hair. So the Prophet let his hair hang down at first, but later on he parted it. That's quite a significant thing there. It's not just letting you know about how Muhammad parted his hair. It's actually saying that Muhammad started off copying what the Christians and the Jews did. That was where he got his practice from. He copied what the Christians and the Jews did. Now, we all know that when Muslims pray, that they all face in a particular direction, and maybe you've seen pictures of Muslims all lined up together, facing a particular direction to pray. And you may know that the direction that they're praying is towards Mecca. However, that's not where they began to pray. To begin with, Muhammad prayed towards Jerusalem along with the Jews. And it was only after some time, as you would have read in your preparation, after some time that he then changed his direction and made it Mecca. You may have heard the Muslims calling out to prayer, the voice that echoes out from the minaret, calling Muslims to prayer. Well, again, in your preparation, you would have read how they came to do that. It was through a discussion they had, and the discussion was, how should we call people to worship? The Jews blow a horn to call people. The Christians, they ring a bell. Well, what should we do? And it was suggested that they should have a man call out from a minaret. But you see how they worked out what to do. It was to be the same as the Christians and the Jews, but yet to be distinct. Again, when to meet. And this again was in your preparation. What day were the Muslims to meet on? Well, again, this was a discussion. The Jews meet on Saturday, the Christians meet on Sunday, and it was worked out, well, we're going to meet on Friday. But again, you see, it's worked out over and against the Christians and the Jews. Muhammad was influenced by the Christians and the Jews. And at around 40 years of age, he announced that God had called him to be a prophet. His message in simple form was that there is one God, Allah, and that idols are of no use and are not to be used, and that he was the prophet of Allah, and that God's rule was coming. Now, when Muhammad began his work, claiming to be a prophet, it was around the year 610 AD. And he stayed in Mecca preaching for the next 12 years. During this time, he had very few followers. Very few people actually responded to him. Life was made difficult for the few followers that he had, and for him. There was persecution of his followers by the Meccans who rejected his message and saw it as a challenge to themselves. Many of his followers fled for safety and immigrated to Christian Abyssinia, where they were protected. But as Muhammad travelled to different marketplaces throughout Arabia, he preached his message there, and other people in other towns became Muslims. He was given protection in Mecca by his uncle. However, when his uncle died, he lost his tribal protection and he was forced to flee and move to a town in the north called Medina. It was in Medina that Muhammad spent his next 10 years. And it was in Medina that things changed for Muhammad. In Medina, Muhammad became their judge. Medina was a divided city, and he was able, through his tact and his astuteness as an intelligent man, to bring about peace between these people. And so he became their judge. And it was in Medina that he started the first Islamic army. And this is where the Islamic calendar begins. The Islamic calendar does not begin with the birth of Muhammad. It does not begin with his claimed call to become a prophet, but it begins with the establishment of the first Islamic state in Medina. With his army, he began raiding and making alliances with the different tribes who were around him, and he had a number of battles with the Meccans. Now, what did it mean to become a Muslim at this stage? Well, it certainly meant to believe that there was one God and that Muhammad was his prophet, but it was far more than this. It meant to join the struggle, or the jihad, as the word jihad means struggle. It meant to join the struggle with Muhammad to bring the rule of Allah. And this meant fighting for Muhammad. This is what it meant to become a Muslim. Now, how did the different people become Muslims, the different tribes? Well, it varied from tribe to tribe, and you would have read some of this in your preparation. So there was the Khazra tribe. These were the tribe based in Medina. And this tribe, we're told, when they heard Muhammad and they heard the message that he was preaching, that they were convinced that he was a prophet. They heard his message, it made sense to them, and they weren't compelled by anybody. They just became Muslim because they believed what this man was saying. That's how some tribes became Muslims. Other tribes, though, like the Qatma tribe, things were very different. That tribe opposed Muhammad. They didn't want to have to bow the knee to him and to acknowledge him as their master. And so when anyone in that tribe spoke out against Muhammad, he would send in an assassin to kill them. And again, you read this in your preparation, how an old man spoke out against Muhammad, and so he was assassinated at night. And then a woman spoke out against Muhammad, and so she was assassinated at night. And then finally, after those people have been assassinated, that tribe then converted to Islam because, and I quote, they saw the power of Islam. And that's how they became Muslims. Now, the Jews and the Christians didn't accept Muhammad. A few did individually, but there were no tribes of Jews or Christians who accepted Muhammad. And this eventually led to hostilities, particularly between the Jews and Muhammad. As I said before, there were 3 Jewish tribes in Medina. The first tribe were exiled from Medina with their possessions. The second tribe were exiled without their possessions. And finally, the last tribe were just executed. The hostility between Muslims and Jews is primal. It goes right back to Muhammad. After conquering the rich Jewish towns of Khyber, Muhammad then sent emissaries or ambassadors to the foreign powers who were around him, to the Byzantine emperor, to the Kaiser of Iran, to the ruler of Egypt, to the ruler of Abyssinia, and to all the Arab kings. His message was that Allah has raised up a new prophet and that they were to offer submission and to accept Islam, and that if they did, they would be safe. Now, what was Muhammad trying to do? Was he just trying to make another kingdom? Well, no, he wasn't. Muhammad believed that he was bringing the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Allah. He was building a theocracy where God ruled through his prophet and king. And Muhammad was that ruler. He was bringing the new age of God's rule. There had been the age in the time of Moses and the age in the time of Jesus. But now was the age of Islam. The rule of Allah was being established on earth, and the struggle of Muslims was to bring this rule to bear upon the world. Muhammad kept up his military campaigns and finally conquered Mecca. And after conquering Mecca, the other tribes around the Arabian Peninsula who had been waiting to see what would happen, who would win? Would the main Arab tribe of the Meccans win, or would Muhammad win? When Muhammad finally conquered the Meccans, the other Arab tribes capitulated, and they sent delegations to Muhammad offering submission to him and accepting Islam. And so Muhammad had removed the importance of tribal divisions that had been on the Arabian Peninsula for thousands of years, and instead he now made religion the defining characteristic for the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad died 632 AD, and when he died, many of the Arab tribes, and you read this in your preparation, many of the Arab tribes left Islam and apostatized. So most of the Arabian Peninsula fell away from Islam and left Islam by choice. And the new ruler or caliph, Abu Bakr, who took control of the Islamic community after Muhammad, his first duty was the war against the apostates, where they basically went around the whole perimeter of the Arabian Peninsula, bringing it back into subjection forcefully into Islam. The Jews and the Christians who hadn't converted to Islam were now forced to leave the Arabian Peninsula. They were exiled from their homelands and sent out of the Arabian Peninsula. And so Arabia became Islamic. Having secured the Arabian Peninsula, the Muslims now continued with their jihad and conquest to conquer the rest of the world, to bring it under the rule of Allah. And they established a massive empire, far bigger than the Roman Empire. Within 120 years, they'd gone right up into Paris and ruled over Spain for 500 years, and then gone right across to India in the east. It was a massive empire that they conquered. As they conquered, they gave the nations that they conquered three choices. The first was become a Muslim and join with us in this conquest. The second was accept subjugation and be a second-class citizen. Or the third was to die fighting. They didn't force people to become Muslim, but they did force the issue of Islam upon them. And this is how Islam spread. Islam was the religion of the empire, the imperial religion. And if you are not a Muslim, you're not a full citizen. In all the lands that they conquered, they set up colonies, and in many times, these colonies outgrew the indigenous populations. In terms of trade, they brought about a new flow of trade from east to west, which had never really happened before. With the Persians off in the east and the Romans off in the west, it meant that trade between those two empires was always hindered in some way. But now, with one empire across that region, trade flowed and ideas flowed freely throughout the empire. Because they conquered the old Greek empires and the Persian empires, they inherited the learning of those people and were quick to pick up the ideas and the teachings of these people and to translate the Greek philosophy into Arabic. And so the Arabs then became the new custodians of science and mathematics and medicine, and they developed this. And so the Islamic Empire made its impact on the world. I now want to look at the history of Islam and world history. Because you cannot understand world history without reference to the conquests of Islam. You cannot understand the history of the Middle East without understanding the Islamic conquests and colonisation. You cannot understand African history, and particularly North Africa and all the many jihads that were launched from that into the south and the slavery that the Muslims did. You can't understand African history without understanding the Islamic conquests. You cannot understand Indian history and the whole issue of Kashmir without understanding the Islamic conquest, because that's where they went across to. You cannot understand European history without understanding the Islamic conquests, because the Islamic empires are vital to understanding the history of Western and Eastern Europe. Islam conquered and occupied much of Europe. The Europeans lived in fear of the jihad that was waged against them for hundreds of years. Western Europeans were a source of slaves for hundreds of years by the Muslims, who went on regular raiding trips. You see, you cannot understand the Crusades without understanding the hundreds of years of jihad against Western Europe that led to the Crusades. You can't understand the birth of the European empires without understanding the Crusades and the empires that came against them. It is often said that the Europeans owe the Islamic world for science and learning and mathematics and medicine. And this is true, that it was the Muslims who brought these ideas to the West. But yet the West didn't need to be conquered to have these ideas brought to it. It probably would have happened faster if the Muslims hadn't come and conquered us. In fact, I would argue that it would have happened sooner if because the Islamic conquest actually made it harder for Europeans to travel in the Middle East, as the language of the Middle East changed from Greek to Arabic, and the flow of ideas to Europe was altered. So yes, Islam brought learning to the West, but yet it most likely would have happened anyway, and most likely would have happened faster if they hadn't conquered the Western countries. Finally, I want to look at the question of how does the Bible, how do we as Christians interpret the history of Islam? What should we make of this history? Well, to answer this, I need to tell you a bit more of the history of Islam. We've seen how the kingdom of Islam and the empire of Islam spread quickly, but actually within 30 years after Muhammad's death, Muslim leaders and Muhammad's close companions were being assassinated by fellow Muslims. Uthman and Ali were assassinated. Civil war broke out very, very early. As I said, within 30 years, civil war broke out within the Islamic Empire, fighting over who should lead the Islamic Empire. Sunni Muslims believe that it should be an elected leader from the community, while Shiite Muslims believe it should be a leader from Muhammad's family. And this internal warfare has always been part of Islam and always will be. In fact, reading the history of Islam is like reading the history of Israel as recorded in the books of Kings and Samuel. What do I mean by that? Well, in the books of Samuel and Kings, God does indeed build his kingdom under Solomon and David. But as soon as the kingdom is built, under Solomon, it then divides and fights within itself, and it fails to be God's kingdom on earth. It fails to be a theocracy. And Muhammad repeated this failure. You see, the lesson that we're meant to learn from the book of Kings is that the theocracy will never work with a sinful ruler and with sinful people in the kingdom. That's the message of the book of Kings, isn't it? That sinful rulers come, sinful kings of Israel, who are meant to be leading God's people, God's kingdom, the theocracy. And yet it fails because sinful leaders and sinful people cannot bring about God's theocracy. The empire that Muhammad started was doomed from the start. It never worked, and it still doesn't work today. And when Muslims try to promote Islam to you and say, Islam is the answer to the decadence of the West, Islam is the answer to bring justice to this world, when they make these claims, you need to ask them, well, which Islamic state should we follow? Saudi Arabia, Iran? Should we follow the Shiite schools? Or should we follow the Sunnis? They have 4 different schools. Which one are we going to work? Most of the Muslims I've spoken to said, oh, there is no true Islamic state in the world today. Well, if that's the case, where Islam is in control, it means it doesn't work. It fails. It always fails, and they are always having to make revolutions to try to reinstate it. It fails. It is only Jesus who is able to bring God's kingdom. Man cannot establish the kingdom of God. It is only Jesus who can bring the kingdom of God, because Jesus deals with the problem of sin. Jesus is God's true king, God's sinless ruler, who has established God's kingdom forever through his resurrection from the dead. He is the king that we can look to, who is stainless and sinless, the true leader of God's kingdom. And he's the one who has the power to change God's people, to bring about a genuine forgiveness and a change in their hearts, and ultimately the genuine change of the resurrection, so that they can share in the kingdom of God. You see, it is Jesus who has been raised from the dead to bring God's eternal kingdom. The only theocracy that works is Jesus at the right hand of God. And this is why, as Christians, we have a better kingdom to offer Muslims. A kingdom that answers the issues of our sinfulness and our failure to bring about God's rule here on earth. And this is the kingdom, the gospel message that you need to bring to your Muslim friends.